and welcome to our webinar on travel and blood cancer. The Leukaemia Foundation acknowledges the traditional owners of the various lands from where you are viewing today, and we recognise their deep and continuing connection to land, sea, community and culture. We pay our respects to their elders past, present, emerging, and anyone here today. To set the scene for us, I'd like to introduce our first speaker today, Lyndall Wheels. Lyndall was diagnosed with myelodysplasia in February 2015 after returning from a family trip to the USA. As for most people, the diagnosis came as a complete shock. Her biggest relief at the time was getting the news she was okay to travel to Adelaide for work the following week. She was warned to keep an eye on her temperature and know how to get to the local hospital if there were any signs of temperature spikes or illness. Linda's choice of study and career has focused on travel as a priority, and she has always been passionate about exploring the world. Rather than stopping her travel, her diagnosis has inspired her to travel more widely with her family, no longer putting off what she always thought she had plenty of time to do. Between travel for work and holidays, Lyndall has been on approximately 10 international trips and many more domestic trips since her diagnosis. In 2017, her MDS morphed into AML, leading to a bone marrow transplant in December that same year. But she was back on a plane 5 months later. Leukaemia didn't stop her travel. COVID lockdowns achieved that. But having just returned from 5 countries in 5 weeks, she's now making up for those lockdown years. In fact, she is joining us today from New Zealand. Thank you, Lyndall, for so generously joining us, and welcome to our webinar today.
Thank you very much, and hello to all out there. Just to add a little bit, I suppose, to the introduction, just to, I suppose, preempt some of the things that I might be referring to later, is that I'm sort of from the Newcastle, New South Wales area, so regional New South Wales. And it was, yeah, as I said, February 2015 that I was diagnosed. And in 2017 was the end of 2017 was the bone marrow transplant. My career is in conference and event management and association management. So my choice of career was very much around what I could do to actually travel. When I was initially diagnosed, I was neutropenic. My hemoglobin, white blood cells and platelets were all low, but not critical to start with. From very early on, with early discussions with my hematologist, I had a conversation with him about travel and what I had planned for the future, because, you know, at the beginning of the year, I can pretty much map out where I'll be traveling that year and what travel actually meant to me. And one thing I actually said at the time was that not being able to travel would be like losing a limb for me. And I did actually follow up to that. So that was probably a really silly thing to say, but hopefully that gave some indication of how important sort of travel was to me. In the month after diagnosis, one of the first things I did was actually plan a trip to Africa. One place that I've wanted to go. I'm a huge animal lover, always have wanted to go to Africa, but it was never the right time. It was always, you know, the kids were too young or too busy to do this, etc. And so suddenly it's like, there is no way I'm putting off this plan any longer. So suddenly there was no right time. And I just wasn't going to miss out on my lifelong dream. And we booked 3 weeks for the end of that year. So just before we got there, in April of that year, I had travel planned with clients, and I was due to do a conference group on a Mediterranean cruise. Obviously great fear at first of if I was even going to be able to get there, as I learned more about the condition, but I did speak with a hematologist who was very supportive of me, and I have to thank him really for every trip that I went on. And obviously, you know, we looked at what advice was needed to just be careful, travelled with a thermometer, travelled sort of with an understanding, I suppose. And this was all pre-COVID times. And I actually did get sick while I was away. I was taking my temperature regularly. I did have a little bit of fear in all of that. I mean, it really was just a cold. But, you know, it had been drummed into me so much that, you know, I could go from being perfectly well to being, you know, dead within 4 hours because I had no neutrophils. But really it was just a cold, and maybe that cold was, you know, made me feel more confident in the future that, you know, I can actually still be a little bit sick while I'm away, and, you know, not have, you know, everything fall apart around me. In July 2015, so about 5 months after I was diagnosed, I started blood transfusions. And essentially the first blood transfusion was to ensure that I could get on a plane to go to Alice Springs to do some work. And I was told that if I really wanted to get on this plane, I was going to have this blood transfusion. And from that point forward, the haematologist and I worked through my diary and we planned transfusions around all my travel, so both domestic and international. And at first it was quite easy. My transfusions were about 8 weeks apart. But as they got closer together, the more planning we needed to do. And I ended up being transfusion dependent every 2 weeks. It became a bit of a running joke when I turned up at the ward to have the transfusions. They'd be like, oh, where are you off to now? Because normally I'd be having a transfusions a couple of days before we were due to get on a plane to head off anywhere. I'm very happy to sit here and report that any of my international trips, I never had any medical issues. No medical dramas, I should say. And I would often take prophylactic antibiotics either with me, or I'd actually take a course as a stopgap measure in case I needed them. And I do remember I was sitting in a safari lodge in the Okavango Delta, and I had 5 tablets in my hand. I was taking prophylactic antibiotics at that point. And I just said to my husband, you know, if this is what it takes to sit in a place like this, I was watching some elephants, like, you know, playing around, you know, in the distance. If this is what it takes, I will take these tablets without any complaint whatsoever. My itinerary planning also had to adapt a little bit. I'm certainly one person that travels and tries to get the most out of every single day. But we sort of had to adjust it a little bit, where we would do something of a morning, and particularly even traveling with the kids and my husband would do something of a morning. We'd come back in the afternoon where I could have a nap, and then we would head out again that night. And I have to say, I think my family actually appreciated the break of me, my normal itinerary plans of doing, you know, squeezing as much in as possible. Domestically, I had a few more challenges, and it wasn't directly related to the MDS, but it did screw up my bloods with this other issue that I was having, which meant I needed to be hospitalised. I needed to have platelets and packed cells. So travelling for work, I ended up being hospitalised in Brisbane, in regional Victoria, and also in Melbourne. And really, I suppose what I want to say, it's really easy to turn up at a hospital in Australia and present your Medicare card. But the bigger challenge is ensuring that you know the details of your condition or how to reach that information. When you walk into an ED and tell them that you're neutropenic, and rattle off your blood counts, their automatic response, I think, is, oh, this person's been Dr. Googling. But they can't take the risk. If you're saying you're neutropenic and you sort of seem to know, they do get you through the system relatively quickly. And of course, your blood test results quickly confirm that. Twice I walked into a hospital myself. I caught a taxi at one stage and I walked to the hospital at another stage. But at one stage I did actually have to call an ambulance at 4 o'clock in the morning because it was really the only time in this whole period that I actually ever had a temperature spike and just knew that I had to get to hospital pretty much straight away. There was one time in Melbourne, it was probably the silliest thing that I ever did. And I flew to Melbourne with my hemoglobin at 67. Knowing that I needed a transfusion. And I sort of thought I could quickly do this 4-day trip and then come back and get bloods. It wasn't a planned trip. I actually went to help another colleague who was having a medical issue. So I actually stepped in for her. But, you know, obviously after the flight, I got to Melbourne and I nearly passed out. And this was sort of working. I was actually based at the Royal Children's Hospital and I went, if I'm going to function the next couple of days, I need some bloods. I walked myself to Royal Melbourne Hospital, which is just up the road, and walked in and essentially went, I need a blood transfusion. They admitted me. I had 2 bags of blood that night. And then I basically discharged myself at about 11 o'clock. I couldn't wait for the doctors any longer. And I walked back to my hotel and I worked quite happily for the next 3 days. And I'm not saying this is necessarily the exact way to go, but I'm just saying that I have faced some things but managed to get through them quite comfortably. In September 2017, the MDS progressed to AML. And I went into hospital for a month of chemo, then a break, and then a round of consolidation chemo while plans were being made for when the bone marrow transplant was going to take place. Whilst I was in the hospital for the second round of chemo, I was actually feeling quite well. And I was actually very busy on the computer booking a trip to the Gold Coast because I wanted to do something with my kids before I actually went into hospital for the bone marrow transplant. This was with the permission of the doctors and the bone marrow transplant coordinator. I wasn't always wildly going off doing crazy things myself. But I just finished booking something. I'd actually booked something for New Year's Eve. And I swear 10 minutes after I just hit send and paid for everything, the bone marrow transplant coordinator came in and said, oh, we've just been contacted from Westmead and they've just actually moved it forward to the beginning of December. So, you know, it's just a matter then of things got credited or cancelled and refunded. So again, I was just sort of working around it. And after I came out of the hospital with 2 rounds of chemo, I actually flew to Hobart. I had been organising an event in Hobart for nearly a year, and it was a really important event to me. I didn't go down to work. Someone did that, but I managed to actually attend the event. I was napping during the day, I was resting, but I actually got to joining it. And to be honest, I actually even managed to get on the dance floor and have a bit of a short dance. So for the BMT, after the BMT, I came out of hospital in mid-January 2018. And as I'm located regionally, I had to live in the Leukaemia Foundations alongside there for nearly 3 months. I came home just before Easter that year, and 4 weeks later flew to Palm Cove, Queensland, to actually run a conference. It's a family-friendly trip. We only conference for half a day, which again, I just had to manage it to make sure I could nap in the afternoon. But again, you know, I was just trying to manage it. I had my family around me, supporting me. Absolutely enjoyed it. And again, got on the dance floor and I managed to do half a Nutbush City. And then from there, work just slowly came back. But I was quite happy that I managed to get to Thailand 11 months after the bone marrow transplant. And that was for work. And again, there was a team around me. And I managed to do that. And we went to an elephant sanctuary after. And I have to say, my illness got me out of shoveling elephant poo. But overall, we just had a wonderful trip. So that's my 10 minutes. I could talk for hours about different things and various other challenges, but I will leave it there with you.
Thank you, Lyndall. You've certainly shared a lot of generous, experiences that you've had in your travels and along with your treatment journey. So I'm sure everyone appreciated how you've managed to do that. I'd now like to extend a warm welcome to Mr. John Verrill. John is a principal of Verrill and Watson Lawyers and is a superannuation and insurance specialist. He's a passionate supporter of people living with injury, disability and chronic illness. John is on the boards of the Consumer Action Law Centre and the Chronic Illness Alliance and several other consumer advisory councils. He's a volunteer at Social Security Rights Victoria and the Mental Health Legal Service. He has been a member of the Financial Ombudsman Service, the Superstream Advisory Council, the Stronger Super Implementation Committee, the Natural Disaster Insurance Review Panel, and the AFCA Transition Board. He has worked in the areas of superannuation, insurance, Centrelink, and financial services law for 28 years and provides advocacy and advice to consumers, workers, community groups, and disability groups. Over to you, John, and thank you for sharing your extensive knowledge in this area.
No worries. Morning, everybody. I suppose much as that was a long list, and there is one other thing that I was involved in that is relevant to this, and that is there used to be a mob called the Travel Compensation Fund, which is covered people who had claims against travel agents who went bust, and then there was that morphed into a thing called the industry, which is called AFTA, had a code compliance committee, and I was the consumer rep on that. So we actually dealt with a lot of travel industry issues around travel agents, etc. So anyway, I was involved in that, and I can talk about that a bit. I've done a presentation or a sort of a background document which sort of spells out in more detail some of the little tidbits of stuff I'll talk about now. So have a look at that. That's going to be sent around to you guys. Have a look at what's there, and it gives you more detail around stuff. But all of this stuff is about basically identifying a couple of the key issues for people with chronic illness and blood cancers in particular. And hopefully it'll tell you where to go and what to look for and where to go to get help and get advice and whatever, if you're in a situation where you're looking to travel and you want to get advice around or get information around insurance, Centrelink, where we've got reciprocal arrangements, COVID-related stuff, which I'll talk a bit about, disability insurance stuff. Anyway, it's all there, and hopefully it'll trigger you to have a look at this stuff to get you to so you can plan for it. And then if you are caught in a situation where you want to look at a claim or you've got issues where you might have insurance or might not have insurance, then this will tell you where to go and how to get help, right? So we've only got a short period of time, so I'm only going to cover a couple of issues. The most burning one is travel insurance. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I'll talk a little bit about Centrelink issues. So if you're traveling, what it means for Centrelink if you're on it, or alternatively, disability insurance benefits, what it means for travel, if you travel, what it means for that sort of stuff. And then if we've got time, talk just a tiny bit about travel agents, and also where we've got, Australia's got reciprocal Medicare arrangements if as an alternative to travel insurance. But the concentration here is around travel insurance, and the big issue that people have, if you've got a chronic illness and you want to travel, can you get travel insurance is a big issue. And if you can get it, what can you get? And then if you get it and you've got a problem overseas, what can you do if you run into trouble? The biggest thing that most people think is that if you've got an existing health condition that's a chronic condition, such as a blood cancer, does it mean that you can get travel insurance at all? And the answer is yes, you can. You can certainly get travel insurance for non-medical, because there's two types of travel insurance, isn't it? There's medical travel insurance, which covers things like medical treatment overseas, hospitalizations, medevacing back to Australia, right? And also cancellation. So if you develop a health condition before you travel, does travel insurance cover cancellation fees and not only cancelling flights, but cancelling accommodation, cruises, that sort of stuff. So the non-medical stuff covers, loss of baggage, theft, accidental damage overseas, that sort of stuff. Can you get cover for that? Yes, you can get cover for that. For the non-medical stuff, there's no problem. You can get cover for that. Back in the bad old days, there was a celebrated case where a travel insurer tried to refuse someone who had cancer from getting insurance cover for loss of baggage and stuff like that. And that went to the Human Rights Commission and then went through the courts. And the court said, you can't, this is a breach of the Disability Discrimination Act for you to deny someone something that has absolutely nothing to do, whether they're going to be covered and whether they're going to be able to claim has nothing to do at all with whether they've got a health problem, such as if your bags get caught on a carousel or pinched off a carousel. So yes, so insurers have all fallen into line since then. So you can get covered for non-medical stuff, no problem at all. But it's the cover for the medical stuff that's the problematic thing. And the medical stuff is medical treatment overseas, from whether it be from GPs, whether it be from hospitals, getting medication covered, and the medevacing, which is a big important thing. So can you get cover for that? That's probably divided into two parts. One is, yes, you can get cover for non-pre-existing condition stuff. So if you have if you travel overseas and you have an injury or you get sick for something that is not a pre-existing condition, again, no problems, you can get cover for that. And you can get cover for that without having to declare that you've got a pre-existing condition, right? So when you apply for travel insurance, you're not usually asked for information about whether you've got a pre-existing. You don't have to fill in a health questionnaire. You get the cover automatically, and you get the cover for non-medical, loss of baggage, that sort of stuff, and medical for injuries and sicknesses that occur overseas, right? It's only for the pre-existing conditions that the cover is problematic. And the general rule of thumb is that if you've got a pre-existing condition, for example, a blood cancer, you are not covered. You won't be covered if that pre-existing condition is a cause of the health problem that you suffer overseas. It's related to it, right? And if you're under active treatment at the time you leave Australia. So, for example, if you're on medication, if your condition is active, you're under active, seeing doctors, etc. So that would qualify as a pre-existing condition if you're under active treatment at the time you leave, right? So you are not automatically covered if that pre-existing condition is the cause of the health problem that you suffer overseas, right? That's under the sort of the default automatic arrangements if you take out travel insurance. If you want it, but you can get cover for that pre-existing condition in some circumstances. So the way you do it is that you've got to apply for cover, right? So ordinarily, if you're applying for travel insurance, you don't have to disclose the pre-existing condition, but you just don't get cover for it, pre-existing condition-related conditions or health problems that occur overseas. If you want to get cover for the pre-existing condition, if you want the peace of mind about that, then you've got to apply for the cover before you go. So when you fill in your application for travel insurance, whether it's online or through a travel agent, you apply for cover for a pre-existing condition. And you do that by filling in the details, telling them what the health problem is, telling them that if it is indeed the case that your blood cancer is in remission and you're not an adverse risk of getting, and you're not crook, and you're not an adverse risk of getting crook overseas, right? And to support that, it would be really important to get a report from a doctor, particularly a specialist, so a hematologist, an oncologist, to say that, yes, you've got a blood cancer, but it's in remission, if indeed it is, or even if you are under active treatment, but you're not an adverse risk of getting sick and making a claim overseas while you're overseas. They're the sort of the factors that insurers are looking for, right? So a couple of steps there. One, when you apply for travel insurance, you'll be covered for everything except for your pre-existing condition. Two, if you want to get cover for your pre-existing blood cancer, fill in an application form, do it 3 or 4 months before you're due to leave, right? So you've got to do a bit of planning here, because you've got to give the insurance company time to consider the application, and then if they knock it back, to go through the review process that I'll talk about in a sec, right? So do it months before, preferably not. I know people tend to make sort of decisions on a whim about travel and sort of short term, but in this sort of scenario, you've got to give time. You've got to leave some time to do that, right? So, and it's important to fill in the application that'll ask you about the condition. If it is indeed the case that you're not crook from it, you're asymptomatic, you're in remission, say so, and get something from your doctor, preferably a specialist, to say so. You submit that to the insurer. They've then got, and then they'll usually make a decision within a month or so, right? And hopefully they'll accept the application. They might accept it on the face, they might accept it with a premium loading, and they'll make a decision. If they knock you back, you've then got rights of review. There is an internal right of review called an IDR complaint, where you can go back to the insurance and say, look, your decision is wrong. It's unfair. Sure, I've got a blood cancer, but I'm not an adverse risk of getting crook overseas. And here's the evidence. Here's further evidence to support that. So you go through this complaints process. The insurer's got 45 days to make a decision on the complaint. If they say yes, on you go. If they say no, you can then potentially take it too. You've got rights of review, but by that stage, the ship's probably sailed on. By the time you get a decision on that, the trip will have come and gone. So they're the avenues. That's sort of the general process by which you can get travel insurance. You won't. There aren't really any insurers that will say, we will cover you for a pre-existing condition, no matter what the status of your health problems, right? But there are ways and means of getting it, as I say, right? But it is important to get travel insurance anyway. And I'll talk about this later, but there are some countries where you cannot come into the country if you don't have travel insurance. So you can't travel without it, right? well, you may not be able to get the full suite of cover if you've got a pre-existing condition that no insurer will take you on for, but you got to have travel insurance in some places, right? That's sort of your process to go through. A lot of people say, well, who's the best travel insurers to go through? That's a question I get asked all the time. The answer is it varies, right? And it varies depending on the type, what you want, and also varies in time because insurers change their attitudes over time, right? Some are good at sometimes, some are good at others. The sort of common ones to look for: Covermore, Insure and Go, Allianz, RACV. They're pretty good. Some people they're pretty good. I've seen a number of examples of people who've got cover that are even some where you thought, well, they might struggle to get insurance cover where they've got it, but it really does vary, right? There's no one insurer who you'll get cover for sure with, right? Travelex is another one. iCover, they're sort of the bigger ones. One thing there is some people get cover, or note of warning, some people can get sort of automatic or travel insurance if you've got credit cards, like if you've got an Amex card, or if you've got, a Commonwealth Bank card and you've got a gold credit card or whatever, and you get cover, you get in travel insurance for free as part of that. A lot of those travel insurances are pretty limited, and some of them are sort of normal, but a lot of them are quite limited. So a word of warning, if you think, oh, well, I'll get this travel insurance for free, then sure you will, but so often you pay for what you get, right? So they don't usually, then as a general rule, they're not the full suite of cover that you're getting, and you won't have your best chance of getting cover through them. All right. So that's sort of general stuff about travel insurance. I'll be interested to hear when we have the Q&A, if people have got experiences of insurers that they have got cover through, then that's something to share amongst folk. But it does change, and it really is a question of horses for individuals. An insurer will make an individual decision on your application with your circumstances, your health problems, about whether they'll give you the cover for the pre-existing condition. And as I say, some of them will give you cover, but you'll cop a loading. So the insurance premium will go up. It might go up 25%, 50%, 100%. I've seen 250% loadings on insurance, right? So it can get very expensive. I mean, travel insurance is expensive anyway, even though it's like short term, the cover itself is actually quite expensive, and the return on premium per premium dollar is one of the least generous of insurance brands. So the insurers do pretty well out of travel insurance, right? So go for it. Anyway, so if there are any questions about that, I'm happy to talk to you about it at the end or any time in the future. So that's sort of travel insurance. There is one subset of travel insurance that we do need to talk about in the last couple of years, and that's COVID cover, right? So can you get insurance cover for COVID? The answer is yes. Insurers have sort of adapted to the pandemic that hit in March 2020, and it is possible to get COVID insurance cover. So it covers things like treatment and medical transport overseas. And it also covers trip cancellations, right? So cancellations is a big thing. There are some insurers that do restrict the cover. So some insurers have sort of cooling off periods or waiting periods. So when you take out the cover, they won't cover you if you contract COVID within the first period of time, whether it's 3 days, 7 days, 21 days, right? They might say we won't cover you if you contract COVID in that time, because they think you may have had it anyway or symptomatic, and they don't want to go through the process of determining that. So they just simply have this sort of cutoff of saying we've got a qualifying period. And some of them restrict the cover overseas. They'll generally speaking, you get covered if you contract COVID whilst you're overseas. But some of them will restrict the cover to medical treatment. They won't cover border closures. So if a border is closed because of COVID, they may not cover you for that. if there are quarantine restrictions put in place because of COVID overseas by a particular country, they may not cover that as well, okay? It does vary, unfortunately. And some of them have limitations, particularly for cruises, right? So some of them have restrictions if you go on a cruise where you're stopping at multiple points, which most cruises do. And they might not cover you for that because they're seen as too much of a risk. And we've seen an example in the last few days about cruise ships and the risks that can be inherent with those. But look, it is possible to get COVID cover these days, but there are some restrictions. And unfortunately, and I hate using the word, but it really is the case, you've got to look at the fine print. And that's one thing with travel insurance. Travel insurance is you either buy it online or through a broker, usually through a travel agent. And the glossy brochures that they come in are dirty big long things with really tiny fine print. And you might say, well, where do I look in that? Well, one place to look at is the definition of pre-existing condition. They've all got clauses that say, what is a pre-existing condition? That's an important place to look at. And also look at the COVID stuff. But look, if there are any questions about that, I'm a nerd who looks at this stuff, so you can ask me anytime, right? But one thing that is important is if you're going to get COVID, is to take out the insurance cover, travel insurance, as soon as you book, because what that then covers you for is cancellation between the date of booking and the date you travel. And as I say, because some travel insurance policies with COVID at least, have a qualifying period where you've got to have the cover in place for a certain period of time before you travel, but for cancellation purposes. It's important to book it as soon as you get it. Like a lot of people like me, they only book travel insurance like a couple of days. They go, oh shit, I forgot to book it. And they only book it like a couple of days before they're due to travel. Don't do that. Don't do that. Don't do what I do. Take it out as soon as you book the trip, because then if you have to cancel because of COVID, then that will be okay. That should be okay. All right. All right. So that's sort of general stuff about travel insurance. I'll leave it there. One thing that people, if you can't get travel insurance, Australia does have reciprocal Medicare arrangements with a handful of countries overseas, so that if you get sick overseas, you can present to, it's often restricted to hospitals, so you can present to emergency department of public hospitals overseas. It often does not cover GPs, and it often does not cover medication and ambulance, but you can go to public hospitals, right? But there are only a handful of countries like this. The key ones are the UK, Ireland. There are some of the Scandinavian countries and a couple of the European countries. But generally speaking, Asian countries aren't in these reciprocal arrangements. The US is not. Big, red flag there, because that's their medical system is so expensive. Canada's not on the list. There is a list. It's on the Services Australia website, and you got to check it. Check it to get the update on it, but there is only a handful of countries like that, but there are some out there, right? But the key one, I suppose the key one is the UK, right? So that's that stuff. I want to talk very briefly about Centrelink. And sort of income while you're overseas. So Centrelink, if you're on Centrelink benefits, whether that be the disability support pension or job seeker payments, what happens if you go overseas? And this is a question we get often asked a lot. I'm a volunteer at the Centrelink Legal Services in Victoria. It's called the SSRV. And we get questions a lot from people saying, look, I've got a health problem. I'm on the disability support pension, or I'm on job seeker with an exemption under the work test. Can I travel? What happens if I go overseas, or I've got to go overseas? There's an emergency going on. I need to go over there for a funeral, that sort of stuff. Can I travel? And what happens while I'm overseas? The answer is, if you're on job seeker, and that includes job seeker with a work test exemption, the minute you leave Australia, you're off payments, right? I don't make the rules. You're off payments, and you should tell Services Australia before you go to sort of keep in their good books But it doesn't matter if you don't, because there's this border force thing where as soon as you go through customs to leave the country, bing, a notification goes to Services Australia, which is the new version of Centrelink, and they will immediately take action. It's all automated, right? So if you're on those payments, your payments are suspended for the period of time that you're overseas. When you come back to Australia, you notify them, and they will just the payments will either restart. You might have to reapply. You might have to go through a waiting period again. But for the period of time you're overseas, you get crickets. If you're on the disability support pension, you can travel overseas. If you travel overseas for 28 days, for a period of up to 28 days within a 12-month period, your disability support pension will continue for that period of time, right? If you plan to travel for more than that, then your DSP will stop after 28 days, right? And that can be quite problematic, because if it stops when you come back to Australia, Centrelink will make it, or Services Australia will make a decision about whether they will simply automatically reinstate your DSP or whether you'll have to reapply again, right? There is actually nothing in the rules, Centrelink rules, that say they have to automatically reinstate your payments. So that you could have to go through a new application process. The big significance of that is if you've been on the DSP, there was a big change made to the DSP eligibility in 2010. If you're on the DSP from before 2010, it was a lot easier to get on it. And if you're on it from there before then, you're still on it under those old rules, right? Those old generous rules. But if your DSP stops and you have to reapply, you'll have to reapply under the new rules since 2010, and they're a lot tougher. It's a lot harder to get on the DSP if you went on it after 2010, right? So if you're a long-term DSP recipient, disability support pension recipient, right, under the old generous rules, if you go overseas for more than 28 days, if your DSP is stopped and you come back to Australia and you're forced to reapply, you might struggle to get back on the DSP, depending on what the nature of your health problem is and how crook you are. So it could have significant consequences if you travel overseas, right, and stay overseas for more than the 28 days. There is a process by which, if you're going to be overseas for more than 28 days, you can apply for an extension of your DSP beyond the 28 days. But to do that, you've got to make this application. There's two major grounds on which you can get it. One is if you've got what's called a manifest grant, and a manifest grant of the DSP is a very limited basis. One is if you've got a terminal illness, which is less than 2 years to live, or another is if you need nursing home level care. You can get an automatic grant of the DSP, or sort of a manifest grant, and that can be a basis for which your DSP can continue after the 28 days. You have to have this assessment before you go, and if they grant it, then your DSP will continue beyond the 28 days if you're overseas, right? Another is if you've got no capacity for work for more than 5 years, if that's an assessment done before you leave, then your DSP can continue beyond the 28 days, right? So again, you've got to make these applications before you go, get a decision. If they say yes, great, you're good to go. Your DSP will continue beyond the 28 days. But, and here's the big but and the big warning, if your application is rejected, your file is on someone's desk at Centrelink. And if it is, they might say, well, we've done the assessment and we actually don't think you qualify for the DSP now at all. You don't satisfy the new criteria, the post-2010 criteria. So we're actually going to chuck you, not only are we not going to give you a DSP for more than 28 days, we're going to chuck you off the DSP now, right? So making this application before you go for DSP for more than 28 days comes with a big warning, right? A big warning that you could, number one, you've got to make the application at least 6 weeks before you go to allow this assessment to be done. And secondly, you've got to be careful because it might be that if your application is rejected, that you might lose the DSP altogether. So sort of big note of warning about traveling overseas for more than 28 days. There is one other thing, and that is if you're on the DSP and you go overseas for more than 28 days, if Australia's got reciprocal arrangements, social services, social security arrangements with countries overseas, then you can get the DSP on a continuing basis. Now, there are a number of countries in this category, and that surprisingly it does include the USA and a number of other countries. It's on the Services Australia website. But there's a but, isn't there always? There's a but with that. And the but with that is it's got to have a DSP equivalent. We've got these social security arrangements with other countries, but a lot of them don't have the full DSP cover that we have, right? And it might mean that, yeah, we might have this reciprocal arrangement with the USA, but they don't really have a DSP equivalent like we do. So it's really of no benefit. Now, there is on the Services Australia website, it lists the countries and it lists the type of cover that you've got to work out whether it's got a DSP equivalent. Look, the end result of this stuff is if you're on the DSP, think very carefully if you go overseas for more than 28 days. It really is there is a pathway to do it, but it's littered with minefields. So think very carefully before traveling for more than 28 days. That's sort of the message there. All right, that's that one. Let's quickly move on before I run out of time. If you're on other income benefits, like insurance benefits for disability, right? Can you keep those? Can you get those benefits while you're overseas? So say if you're on income protection payments, right? It's quite a number of people are. I help lots of people with income protection claims. If your claim is accepted and you're on payments, can you travel overseas? The answer is yes, you can. In about 99% or about 98% of policies. There are a handful of policies that say your payments will be suspended whilst you're overseas, or if you're overseas for more than 3 months, say, but the vast majority of them allow you to get payments whilst you're overseas. They don't restrict it if you travel overseas. But there is a logistical problem, and the logistical problem is you usually have to fill in progress report forms every month, right? Or every 3 months. And the problem can be, how do you get one of these forms filled in overseas? The answer is you go to a local doctor overseas to try it. I've had a number of people who've done it, but quite often there might be a language barrier. There might be sort of cultural barriers. There might be all sorts of issues around getting it, or they might look at our documents and go, I don't understand this crap. I'm not signing anything around that. So the message therefore really is, if you're on income protection payments, say, before you go to the doctor and get a certificate, sort of like the day before you leave, right? To cover you at least for 1 month, but try to get a certificate for the period of time that you're overseas, right? Even if you're supposed to be providing these progress report forms every month, sorry, if you get these progress report forms every month, but you're traveling for 2 months, get one filled in for the 2 months, get the doctor to fill it in for the 2 months, like the day before you go, right? If you haven't yet applied, can you apply overseas for income protection or TPD, the lump sum? Yes, you can. You can do it from overseas. You can do it while your claim is being assessed. You can be overseas, but there are some logistical issues there. So again, generally speaking, try to apply for benefits before you go. And if you're on payments, get the doctor to fill it in for the period of time that you're overseas just before you leave, right? To put it in. All right, there's some tips there. What else? I think I've just about run out of time, haven't I? What else? Well, travel agents. Let's talk. So it's just a few travel tips. If you go through a travel agent, look, there's a good reason to go through travel agents. As I say, I was on this complaint scheme that dealt with travel agent issues. There's a general rule, but it's very complicated these days. Travel is a complicated process these days, particularly with things like visas, right? We saw many examples at the ombudsman scheme about people who got into traps because of visa requirements. I'll give you really one quick example. We had one case where someone was traveling from Europe to the States, but they had to go via, their flight went via Canada. And due to a sort of a quirk, they actually had to go through customs in Canada before catching their connecting flight to the States. Because they had to go through customs, this Canadian state had a requirement that you had to have a visa. And the person didn't have a visa because they didn't realize that they had to go through customs as part of the connecting flight, right? That's where travel agents can be really useful, because they either know, or they should know, or they have to know about this sort of stuff, right? And if they don't, like in this example, this case we had, we nailed the travel agent for failing to advise the person about getting the right visa. So it can be complicated. So use of travel agents is important, and there are grounds for complaint against travel agents if they do the wrong thing. This code compliance thing is not great, and it sort of fell off the radar when COVID hit, but but it is there, and you can go through state consumer affairs departments as well, right? And, you know, as I say, look at visas, but you've got to get travel insurance. As I say, some countries require travel insurance. You can't get into the country otherwise. Singapore is an example of that, right? And there's just one other thing I want to talk about really briefly, and it's a bit off point, bit off topic, but it is sort of related a bit. It's related to the COVID and insurance thing. One thing I'm doing is a thing called, there's a big fight going on with the insurance industry at the moment about a thing called business interruption insurance. If you or any partners have run a small business or a business, if you had that business in 2020 when COVID hit, if you had, most businesses carry a thing called business interruption insurance, and there's been a big fight about whether business interruption insurance covers COVID-related downturns in your business. And there was a couple of court cases, and the outcome of the court cases is something like a significant proportion, it's in the thousands of businesses, will have valid business interruption insurance claims that can be worth six-figure sums, right? And a lot of businesses don't know about it. So if you're in that category, you know someone in that category, let me know, all right? I'll shut up now. There'll be opportunity for questions at the end. And if we don't get to those and you've got any questions in the future, you'll get the background material. Give me a ring anytime, okay? Thanks.
Thank you, John. An incredible, extensive amount of knowledge in all of those areas you discussed today. And finally today, Jay Manning will present practical tips you can use to plan fuss-free travel. Jay is an experienced hematological nurse and head of clinical content here at the Leukaemia Foundation. Over to you, Jay.
Welcome everyone to the Travel and Blood Cancer practical tips part of the presentation. So what I'm concentrating on is the pre-travel type of questions you should ask. As John said, planning is really important. Don't leave it to the last minute to talk about all this stuff. And what you should do is think about, and I know people leave it to the last minute, also as John said, but if you're even thinking about going somewhere, you're in the middle of treatment, make sure you talk to your treatment team. You know, even just a throwaway question. I'm thinking about going somewhere in 6 months. How would that look? So check that it's okay to travel, the best time to travel, particularly if you're traveling, I guess, internally in Australia. You know, that's easier than traveling overseas. So really important to check. Get a letter from your hematologist with your diagnosis, treatment plan and ability to travel. Have that anyway, take it with you, take a copy of it, give it to your travel buddy, whoever you're traveling with, so that you have information. Then you don't have to remember all of this stuff and you've got it there ready to go. Check if you need any medical treatment. So if you've got, you know, as Lindell said, she had to have blood transfusions. So make sure you check with your hematologist if that's possible, where you're thinking of going. Some places will organise for you to go to different hospitals to have your medical treatment. Others will suggest somewhere you go. They'll give you a referral letter to a doctor or to the hospital and you organise it yourself. But make sure you organise it before you go. Don't think you can just rock up to a day hospital somewhere and have a blood transfusion with the letter that you've got from your doctor. Talk about COVID-19. We've got a COVID-19 action plan on the website, and that the link to that will be sent with the EDM with the recording of the webinar afterwards as well. Talks about all the questions that people have asked in the pre-questions about COVID, all about antiviral medications, what you need to do about those, whether you can take them with you. You need to talk to your doctor about that. A lot of places you can take it with you as long as you have a script or a letter from your doctor, a letter from the pharmacist explaining it all, and if it's packaged properly with the label on the box as well. Ensure your scripts are up to date and you have extra repeats to cover your time away. Ask for instructions on what to do if you're unwell, and keep that with the letter as well. So then, as Lindell said, you can go to an emergency department, you can hand over those instructions, you can hand over the letter saying what's wrong with you, what treatment you've had, and they should be able to, go straight into action with what you need to do. Ask what to do about any device you have. If you need a PIC dressing or a portacath flush somewhere in your travel time, find out what you would need to do about that as well before you go. Register with Smart Traveller, as been mentioned before. It's a great site. It's got lots of information. I've trawled through it quite a lot, putting this presentation together, and there's a lot of stuff on there that I didn't know was on there. So make sure you have a good look. Travel insurance, John's talked about, as well as Medicare reciprocal rights agreements. Don't be afraid to travel within Australia. Medicare, everywhere across Australia. So just get the letters and everything first. That's the most important thing. Be prepared before you go. Packing instructions. So think about items that are essential for your travel. Put your medications in your hand luggage. Don't put them in your luggage that will go, somewhere else away from you. Keep them close to you. And I know there's been a few questions about how to keep medications cool. Ask your pharmacist for advice when you get the medications. They'll be able to tell you some good tips. Talk to the treatment team as well. They've probably got good tips as well. There's chemical freezer bricks that, stay cool for a long time. Insulated drink bottles are great. If you have Neupogen injections or any of those sorts of things, filgrastim, they can fit in those insulated drink bottles with a tiny freezer brick, that's not very cold, and that will keep them cold. Talk to the travel, the planes, talk to the stewardesses. They'll help you as well if you need to keep something cold. Same with trains. If there's a dining car or anything like that, think about that as well. Take extra medications and scripts just in case you can't get home. If you end up staying somewhere longer than you're planned, then you need to have all those with you. Take a thermometer with you for obvious reasons, paracetamol, first aid essentials like minor dressings as well. Take a photo of your passport, Medicare card, and private health insurance card if you have one, and keep it on your phone or print it and put it in your luggage as well. And leave a copy of those documents with someone at home as well that you'll be able to get in touch with if you need to. Ask for help. Don't be shy. People can only say no, right? So make sure you ask. Ask for help with your luggage. Ask for help with checking in. Talk to the airlines, trains, anywhere, hotels if you're staying. If you need a wheelchair or oxygen, anything like that, ask how you access those. Ask before you go is basically what I'm saying. Don't wait until you get there. Make sure you ask before you go. Check with travel agents, airlines, trains if you can get extra assistance. A lot of places will say yes, but you don't know till you ask. Vaccinations. I noticed there's been a few questions about that as well. Always check with your treatment team what vaccinations you can have. You shouldn't have live vaccines. So that's a problem with yellow fever vaccine for one. And you would need a letter when you go to yellow vaccine countries that you are not eligible to have that vaccine. Lindell's got a good story about that, the yellow fever vaccine. If you're traveling overseas, find out what vaccinations you need to have. Smart Traveller have some information, Health Direct have information, and treatment teams should also have the information as well. Think about the flu vaccine if you're traveling to the Northern Hemisphere in their winter season, because they will have the updated flu vaccine that we don't have yet. So make sure you ask about that. Your COVID-19 vaccination should be up to date, and you'll obviously be able to talk to the treatment team about that as well. When you're there, a few thoughts to keep in mind. Take care with food and drink. Obvious things: don't eat at markets. Drink bottled water if you're overseas. Basic things like that. Wear a mask if you think it's appropriate. So public transport and planes, even in Australia now, as we know, there's lots in the media about the fourth wave that we've got at the moment. So we would recommend you wear a mask, especially if you're travelling on public transport. I'm from Queensland. That's what they've told us here. And I would recommend that all across Australia as well. Preferable to use N95 masks, and take hand sanitizer and use it liberally while you're away. Your travel buddy checklist. If you're traveling with someone, think about how you can help. So your carer or travel buddy should also have all copies of all those documents that you got from the doctor, document and keep some with them as well. If you lose one bag, you've still got essential medications with you. Contact details for your treatment team and hospital. And as I said before, leave a copy of those documents with someone at home. And then the most important thing, don't forget to enjoy your holiday, is one of our biggest recommendations. If you do the pre-planning, you've got there, make sure you enjoy it while you're there. Thanks, Jane.
Thanks, Jay. I think that message at the end, don't forget to enjoy your holiday. And if you stick to those tips and that wonderful list for not just yourself, but your travel companion or carer, I'm sure you'll all have a great time. So now I'd like to thank our panel members for their information and comprehensive presentations. And I'll open up the question and answer session. So over to you, Jenny.
Thanks, John. Brilliant romp through all of the insurance questions that came in. We did have a couple of extras that came along, and I think one of the key ones that's important from an insurance and probably a medical point of view is, how is active treatment defined? There's a lot of people in the blood cancer community that have chronic diseases that are on regular medication. Is that considered active treatment from an insurance perspective?
General rule, yes. Yeah.
It's pretty limiting, isn't it?
It is. It is. Yeah, but that doesn't mean necessarily that you can't get the cover, right? It's you can still go through the process of applying for the pre-existing condition cover by filling in the application form, telling them what the nature of your symptoms is, the nature of the treatment, the nature of the medication you're on, and importantly, getting something from preferably the hematologist to say, look, yeah, he or she's on the medication, but the condition is stable. They're not, the chance of relapse is very limited, and I think they're unlikely to. They're not an adverse risk of getting crook overseas. Yep. Now, the doctor may not be in a position to give that opinion, give that certificate, but at least try. It is possible to get. But it's tough.
It sounds like the key thing here is plan a long way ahead for these sorts of things. I think the other question that's come through is there's a bit of, understandably, there's a little bit of hesitancy in dealing with insurance companies and feeling that people will be treated fairly and transparently and openly. Yeah. So there's some questions around what could people reasonably expect, and is it difficult to make a claim, and is it more difficult to make a successful claim from your experience?
Well, there's two things here. One is to get the cover, right? That's applying for cover. And the other is to make a claim at the end of it, right? Now, with both of them, look, I mean, welcome to my world. I've been dealing with insurers for 30 years. and look, I'm no patsy for insurers, but there's been a big, the world has changed. The way insurers behave has changed over the years. And if not before, then certainly post the Royal Commission into the Banking Royal Commission. Also, the insurers were on the rack in that. And I think there's been a shift over the years, right? And there are a couple of, but it's not just the vibe of it all. There's also some stuff in place, right? So all insurers sign up to, these are travel insurance covers general insurers, because there's general insurers and life insurers, right? So travel insurance is general insurance, and there is a robust code of practice in place that all insurers have to abide by. It's a code of practice that's been in place for like 25 years, and it's gone through about 6 or 7 iterations. It's pretty robust. It's pretty robust. There's also, if you're not happy with an insurer's decision, whether it's not to give you cover or whether it's to reject a claim, there is an ombudsman in place called AFCA. And again, they're fairly robust as well, right? I mean, but insurers are still insurers. And yes, to deal with them can be problematic. So if your claim is rejected, if your application for cover is rejected, or you think it might be rejected, or if you've got a potential claim and there's any doubt about it, as I would say to you, get advice about it. Now, there are community legal sectors that deal with this stuff. There's the insurance advice line, and we deal with it. We do it, and I give advice to anybody. It doesn't cost anything to do it. Happy to give it.
Thanks, John.
So there are a few other organisations like travel. If you're going through a travel agents are actually, some travel agents are good and know a lot about, very experienced with insurance, and they know a lot about insurance. Some not so good, and some of them, think they know more than they do, but nevertheless that they can be a good resource. And the insurers themselves can be, and the insurers all have things called customer advocates, right, who are there in place as sort of an internal better on the worst of insurers. So they're a resource as well. So there are significant resources available.
That's brilliant, John. I think planning ahead and keeping on checking on details, because things change all the time in response to pandemics and industry standards and all sorts of things, is the message there.
Yeah.
Lindell, I wanted to ask you a question, because you've travelled so extensively all over the place and you've got some amazing stories. But I think what I'd like to hear from your perspective is, how do you assess the risks of where you're travelling to? And what sort of things do you do to prepare yourself for travel, and I guess troubleshoot or problem solve?
Yeah. Well, I was actually really happy to see Jay's presentation, and I was going, oh, I did that. So I actually felt quite chuffed in that. Look, my career is in planning, and I'm planning quite often years ahead in terms of conferences and things. So in terms of getting organised early, that's quite easy for me. But, we would be looking at a place, and obviously Africa would probably be the biggest risk place, but I got there 3 times before I had the bone marrow transplant. So since diagnosis to that time, and in a month's time, I'm actually heading back to Rwanda, heading to Rwanda to climb with them, see the mountain gorillas. Part of the planning is obviously get what vaccinations. Certainly haven't been able to have a yellow fever vaccination, but potentially we'll have one this time around. So I've always travelled with a letter. All the things about medications, to make sure I've got medications with me, and that I understand obviously exactly what's needed for it. Travel insurance, I have to say, I never got insurance for my condition. I did have other travel insurance in place, and I'm not sure that's the right thing to say, but I did often joke that if I do need to go to hospital for something to do with the blood, then maybe I should break my arm or leg, and maybe that would help me get home or whatever else I needed. But in saying that, my travel insurance that I sort of went is that I know I need to be able to turn up at an airport. So part of the planning was how I get to a major airport, because sometimes we're in very remote places. And I never worked with a travel agent here in Australia, but I did work with an agent actually based in Johannesburg for all the African travel. And they were very aware of my condition, and they were very aware of sort of what was needed. I travelled with a thermometer, obviously, you know, like looking at temperatures, very aware if I felt unwell. And, you know, there were days where I was like, I just need to go to bed, I need to get some rest. And I just went, I need to know how to get back to a major airport, and I need to know that I can either pay for or put on a credit card a business class air flight, a flight to where I need to get to. And that was either, do I come back to Australia? My first contact ever with the Leukaemia Foundation was to ask about travel insurance, and to learn about the reciprocal countries. That was actually my first call, because that was when I was traveling to Europe. So that my planning was either, do I get back to Australia? Do I get to the UK? Do I get to Malta? Where's the closest country of where I'm going to be that I might need to get to if something is to go wrong? But certainly the backup was that I need to be able to get to the major airport and get on a flight, essentially, if there was something with my blood cancer. And that was why traveling with the antibiotics, that I would start on those immediately. And all of that was discussion with the hematologist.
Brilliant. Great tips. And it leads me to another question that's been asked. It's probably one for you, John, because it relates to insurance. And I guess the question is, if something goes wrong from an insurer's perspective, are they more likely to treat you in the country you're in, or is their instinct going to be to get you home as quickly as possible, depending on the size of the problem?
There's no doubt it's the latter, because as soon as you hit Australia, you're not their problem.
Yep.
They will, you know, it can be very expensive to, you know, book a first class seat for someone, or business class seat, as Lyndall said, and to you know, have a traveling medical companion or whatever. But you know, if you're stuck in a hospital overseas for weeks, that's going to be even more expensive. So their reflex is to get you on a plane as soon as they can and get you here, because as soon as you hit Australia, you're Medicare's responsibility, you're not theirs.
Yep, thank you. I think one of the big questions that comes up, and this might be one for you, Jay, and possibly one for you, Lyndall, is, are there any additional risks when travelling for someone who's had a transplant, stem cell or otherwise, or CAR T therapy? Jay?
I would say yes to that question, depending on how long post-transplant you are. In that space between when you get revaccinated at 1 year-ish, there'll be higher risks. But after that, it depends on how well your immune system has recovered, basically. That's part of the risk. I guess, generally speaking, your immune system is never as good as it was before. So I think you just need to be very careful, probably. And that's, like I say, something to talk to your doctor about, or the treatment team, before you book anything. There's probably some places you shouldn't go, but Lyndall has proven that there's lots of places you can go, I guess. Lyndall, do you want to answer anything else with that?
Look, you know, I've been... I wanted to actually sort of to say and get the message across that whatever decision you make is your decision to make, ultimately. I'm not saying you go and just do things willy-nilly. You're obviously trying to collect as much information as you can. But I have been berated by physicians. I have been lectured at, I have had snide comments, and I have had judgment passed of some of the things that I have done. And I said at the beginning, it's thanks to my hematologist. I'm sure I've given him many grey hairs over the years, but he has been supportive of what I've wanted to do. I mean, I run my own business, you know, travel was just an integral part of it. And then add to that, the love of travel. And when I first said I was going to Africa, I had this absolute, I mean, I wasn't actually planning on telling the doctor. It was my husband that mentioned it. So this wasn't my hematologist, but another doctor that I'd just met for the first time just berated me about why would I be doing that. And to be honest, I went, well, if I'm not going to make this, I'm not going to give up on this. This is what I've wanted to do. And I got there 3 times. So there's sort of that. I mean, I was aware of the risks the whole time. As I said, I tried to mitigate those risks as much as possible, in terms of antibiotics, in terms of, making sure, I mean, the planning was just really, there was more that went into it. Being sensible about giving myself rest time, and having naps during the day, and just sort of changing the itinerary a bit of what I would normally do to make sure that, those sort of things were possible. So I didn't miss out. And as I said, my family actually thought it was great. But, things like even like the wheelchair you mentioned, I used a wheelchair, traveling from Sydney to London, and we were connecting through to Rome. I was exhausted. I barely could put a foot in front of the other. And again, we had the wheelchair. My kids were there. They actually thought it was fantastic. And you know what? I think I'm going to ask for it in future because it gets you on the plane first too, and you don't have to queue up with everybody else. So, we saw the humour in things of some of the things, because first I was like, there's no way I'm getting in a wheelchair to, do it. But I did, and even in saying doing local things, I was living at the Leukaemia Foundation apartments, and I went to a Queen concert. So we'd just come out of the bone marrow transplant. Obviously, this had been booked, 12 months earlier. And I'm again pre-COVID, but got the wheelchair, and we went to the concert, and I had just an amazing time. So I wasn't prepared to quite give up on things that I wanted to do.
Thanks, Lindell. I'm really loving that approach. I think there's a real tension sometimes between what we want to do and asking for help or doing it differently. So that idea of using a mobility aid or taking a nap or changing your itinerary slightly, they're really good tips for how to manage just life, really, I think. Jay, a question did come through about travelling with mobility aids, and I think it's a two-parter in a way, if you'd like to comment. One is about accessing mobility aids at the airport and things to help you with those transfers around big places. And the other is, are there any special questions or considerations if you have to take a four-wheel frame or anything with you?
I think, Jenny, again, goes back to planning. So asking the question before. I think most airports have wheelchairs. We've all seen them. You just have to ask for them. If you want to take your own, I think depends on the airline, depends on the way you're traveling, I think as well. I think again, you need to ask whoever you book with. And if you book online, say you're booking internally and you're booking online, I would call the airline and have a conversation with them. If you're not going through a travel agent who can have that conversation for you, if you're booking it directly, which a lot of people do within Australian travel, then definitely ring the airline and find out. I think being forewarned is forearmed. I guess that's a saying, isn't it?
Yes.
And for both ways, for you and for them, so they know you're coming with a mobility aid, and you know that what their response to that is going to be.
Yeah, thank you. And I think there's a lot of railway stations, airports and things have travellers' aids. So I think going back to something you said in your presentation, just ask wherever you are, whenever you are, just ask, because you never know what might be available and who might be able to help you. There's quite a few questions coming through around antivirals and how easy they are to access and potentially how costly. I don't know if anyone's had experience with that. Lindell or Jay, if you want to make a comment around that. I mean, obviously we can't be too prescriptive because they're things that change all the time, but
one thing I would say, they're available on a script, and I would imagine most patients with blood cancer would be eligible pre-travel, having that conversation either with your GP or with your treatment team at the hospital. So again, ask that question. I answered one question, I think, Jenny, before. You can take them overseas. You can get the script filled before you go, as long as the packaging is intact. And someone mentioned having it translated as well. That's a bit trickier, and that would be something I'd talk to the pharmacist about, because they may have Google Translate or something, and they can translate a label as well. And one other thing I'd say, make sure that the details on the script box match the details in your passport as well if you're traveling overseas, because people have, they use different names sometimes, and it's really important that you are who you say you are as far as customs people are concerned, because that might be one thing that might cause a problem. If you're carrying medications that are in someone else's name, that would be a red flag for them instantly, I would imagine.
Thanks, Jay. John, another one for you. It's a Centrelink one.
Yeah.
And someone's asked, does the reason for the travel affect how Centrelink make their decisions about allowing you to go or extend your stay?
No. There is, I didn't mention before, there is an ability to apply for a second lot of 28 days within a 12-month period if you've come back, right? You can do that as well. There is another section that does allow, if you need to go overseas for an emergency, you can, Centrelink can give you that extra 28 days in a 12-month period for a family emergency. It's quite general, the way it describes it. Yeah, so if there's particular reasons. One of the other ones was if you need to go overseas for medical treatment that's not available in Australia, right? So if you're trying a new experimental treatment overseas, that can be a basis on which you can go for a second lot of 28 days within a 12-month period. Okay, that's a possibility.
Thank you. Someone's also pointed out if you're on a cruise, you're in international waters, so presumably from an insurance perspective, the same rules would apply. They'd get you back to land ASAP so that you can be covered by Medicare.
Correct.
We're getting close to time. I've got a couple of other ones, and I think Jay and Linda, I'll direct these towards you. I think there's some practical questions, particularly when you're travelling internally, but about organising medical checkups, prescriptions, and even monthly chemotherapy. So, Jay, perhaps if I throw to you about some of the basics of what people need to think about, and then perhaps to Lyndall about her personal experience of that.
I guess I would definitely recommend finding out exactly what you would need while you're away. And if you're having regular transfusions, as Lyndall was, then you'll know that anyway. If you need dressings, you probably should be aware of that as well. I think then you have to plan where you want to go and when you're going with what you need. You need those three things to line up. Practically, you can ring the hospitals where you're going once you've talked to your treatment team, because they should be able to give you a letter saying exactly what you need. Ring the hospitals yourself if they don't book it for you. Depends if you're, I think in the private, I worked in the private sector most recently. They will often, we used to organise that all the time for people when they were travelling. I think the public sector's probably not as easy, so you would potentially need to do that yourself. But I think being prepared beforehand, knowing exactly what you need, and most places you'll be able to book in. You might need to be a bit flexible with the days, or, if you normally have your transfusion on a Wednesday, you might have to have it on a Thursday or a Friday or a different day of the week. You'll need to be a bit more flexible, I think, would be my advice. But certainly it's all about the planning ahead and knowing exactly what you need. If you need blood tests, make sure you get a form so you can go somewhere and have a blood test. If you're in the public sector, you need to have that arranged before you turn up at a pathology department at a hospital as well, to have a blood test taken. So yes, talk to your treatment team and get that organised before you go.
And I think one of the things too is making sure that if a referral's sent in advance, it's been received and acted on, not just assuming things that go into the ether, land where they're meant to. Lyndall, do you have any practical tips from your personal experience around that? We might finish the question bit on that, but
look, I was really lucky. All of my domestic trips were essentially short trips, so all the planning was really done with the hospital where I was being treated. So I really didn't need, apart from having to rock up at the hospital when I was feeling unwell. I do agree really strongly with the whole having a letter, because I didn't have the letter. And one of the challenges of living in Australia is, state by state medical system. So yes, it's very easy with a Medicare card to turn up and you don't have any expense. but making sure that, you know, you have access to what's actually going on. And I knew enough about, you know, my diagnosis and my treatment that I could say. But as I said, you know, when you turn up and you say, oh, you know, I've got myelodysplasia, I'm neutropenic, and my hemoglobin was this two days ago because I was having fortnightly blood tests, you know, they sort of almost roll their eyes at you at first. And so a letter to hand over from your doctor is a much better thing to have. But, you know, the first time I was hospitalised, I was in Brisbane. You know, I called a taxi, I walked in, and I was like, you know, I'm being treated at this hospital. And they called, and then they came back and said, oh, no, the hospital says that you're not on their records. You know, you must be getting treated privately. And I'm like, well, I'm not getting treated privately. I know exactly how I'm getting treated. And it was just, you know, a spelling mistake. And that just sort of added to the yeah, I don't want to say trauma, stress, but that added to the stress at the time. And look, I'm really lucky. My sister's a doctor. I had to call her though. I had to call her and go, you know, and so she got onto the hospital and did that. And I did have to actually rely on my sister a couple of times. One hospital I had, you know, like I shouldn't joke about these things, but I do. I joke that, you know, it was a week before I went to Africa. I was hospitalised in a regional hospital in Victoria. And I sort of joked that was just getting me ready in case I had to get hospitalised in Africa, because the experience was not a positive one, like at all. And, you know, there are protocols in Australia if you turn up and you've got risk of neutropenic sepsis, and that should apply no matter what hospital you go into Australia. But let me assure you that is not the case. So having knowledge, having that letter from your doctor, I would say, would be the most important thing. So, and to be honest, knowing how to get in contact with your haematologist or your treating physicians. And I know, you know, not everyone's going to hand out that, but have those numbers with you, because you do necessarily have to go back. I had to have quite an invasive procedure in Brisbane, and I was actually booked in to have that same invasive procedure when I got back to Sydney the next day, essentially. So I was hospitalised on Saturday morning in Brisbane, stayed overnight, flew home Sunday morning, had to have this. So I was like, well, can I just take those results with me? And I was like, no, you can't. And I was like, but they're my results, you know, and I'm about to have this, so that'll prevent me having to have this same invasive procedure in, you know, another 24 hours. And it's like, well, you know, if you had a GP here in Queensland, we could send it to the GP, but you don't. So we don't have the system to be able to send it. So, yeah, that's my bit of advocacy is just, you know, them essentially I see them as my results and I should be able to take them with me, but I wasn't allowed to. So I had to return to New South Wales and basically have the same invasive procedure sort of again. That probably didn't answer exactly what it is, because I didn't really have to go interstate or anywhere else. I was transfusion dependent 12 months after the bone marrow transplant, and I was planning a 5-week trip to South America. And at that point, that was probably the biggest risk that I had, is like, how am I going to do this? And I had started the conversation like in January, and we were going like 5 months later about how am I going to get to South America? Should I be shortening my trip if I'd still need, you know, transfusions every 2 weeks? And we started having a discussion at that point of what I was going to do. And, you know, essentially I wasn't going to maybe not be able to travel for five weeks. But the irony was that conversation ended up being the last blood transfusion that I actually had. And I went to South America for 5 weeks. My hemoglobin wasn't normal, but it wasn't going down. So that was probably the one time my travel plans may have been affected, but I was very lucky that, but you know, again, it was just those discussions that were being had in terms of planning a long way in advance.
Can I just add to that as well? Just remember, sure, if you get unwell when you're on holidays, that will automatically cause you more stress, I think. And just keep in mind that, you know, everyone's going to try and help, but you'll forget things, you'll forget to mention things because you'll be stressed yourself. And so that's why I'm saying have a letter. Even if you're traveling inside Australia, have a letter. Then you don't need to remember anything. You can just hand over that letter. It'll have all your details, and contact details on it would be preferable. They can call your treatment team, haematologist, whoever you're seeing, if they need to. Yeah, just it's a stressful moment, and it's all right when you're going. You don't think that, but the minute you get sick, I'm pretty sure people get really stressed.
Yeah, I think the key things here are plan ahead, keep checking details. You know, aim for the best, plan for the rest, and just keep asking for help.
Thanks, Jenny. And I think that just, highlights the 3 Ps, doesn't it? Plan, prepare, and have pleasure. So that draws our webinar to a close. There's been an incredible amount of information and practical tips provided today from all of our excellent guest speakers. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the supporters of the Leukaemia Foundation, as without them we would not be able to deliver education events such as these. I'd like to thank all of our guest speakers for your generously sharing your knowledge, your expertise, and your time with us today. So once again, thank you and goodbye for now.